Hello and welcome back to her revenge arc. My name is Alara, and I am your narrator, your guide through the quiet, shadowed corridors where justice, long delayed, finally finds its form. The stories we tell here are not tales of sound and fury. They are not born of explosive rage, but of a slow, simmering fire, a pressure that builds over months or even years, until it reshapes the world in a single, silent, deliberate act. Tonight's story is my own. It is a story about many things. About love and the slow, insidious way it can curdle into performance. It's about the subtle weight of condescension, the quiet erosion of self. But most of all, it is a story about wine. Or rather, what wine can be made to represent. It is about a collection of rare and priceless bottles. A liquid museum curated not out of passion, but out of pride. And it is about how I, in an act of quiet rebellion, transformed a temple of arrogance into a monument of profound, and very sticky humility. So find a comfortable place. Settle in. The story I am about to tell you did not happen overnight. It was a vintage of retribution, aged to perfection in the cellar of a wounded heart. And it begins, as so many tragedies do, with a man who believed he was the center of the universe, and a woman who for a time mistakenly agreed with him. His name was Julian. To understand the end, you must first understand the beginning. You must understand the tapestry before I pulled the thread that unraveled it all. Julian was not, at first glance, a monster. Monsters rarely are. They come to you cloaked in charm, their red flags looking like festive bunting from a distance. He was intoxicating, a whirlwind of ambition, charisma, and what I mistook for profound confidence. He was a rising star in the world of finance, a man who spoke of mergers and acquisitions with the same casual authority that other men might use to discuss the weather. He was handsome in that sharp, tailored way that suggests money and discipline. His jaw was firm. His eyes were a piercing, intelligent gray, and his smile, when he chose to deploy it, could feel like a personal sunrise. We met at a gallery opening, a place I, a doctoral candidate in art history, actually belonged, and a place he, a collector of assets, was merely scouting. I was mesmerized by a chaotic, vibrant, abstract piece, lost in the frantic energy of the brushstrokes. He appeared beside me, a flute of champagne in his hand, and said with that devastating smile, "It looks like the artist's emotions had a traffic accident." I should have seen it then. The immediate, dismissive judgment. The need to reduce something complex and passionate into a pithy, cynical one-liner. But I was 26, and I was flattered by the attention of a man who moved through the world with such frictionless ease. I laughed and we started talking. He was witty, he was sharp, and he listened, or rather, he gave an excellent performance of listening. He asked about my thesis on the use of chiaroscuro in the Baroque period. His eyes fixed on mine, making me feel like the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. He made my dusty academic world sound glamorous and important. That was Julian's great talent. He was a master of reflection. He could take the light of another person and bounce it back at them, brighter and more dazzling, making them believe the light originated with him. For the first year I was bathed in that light. He called me his beautiful scholar, his secret weapon of culture. He would bring me to his corporate dinners and introduce me with the flourish. "This is Alara. She can tell you the difference between Caravaggio and Carracci. I can only tell you the difference between a bull and a bear market." Everyone would chuckle, and I would blush, feeling both showcased and slightly fraudulent, a pretty curiosity on his arm. Our life was a curated one. Our apartment was a minimalist expanse of gray and glass, every object chosen by Julian for its aesthetic and brand value. Our friends were his friends, other ambitious men and their beautiful, quiet wives or girlfriends. Our vacations were to places that would look good on social media, places where the right people went to be seen. I was swept up in it, the sheer momentum of his life pulling me along in its wake. I told myself this was what success felt like. I told myself I was lucky. And then there was the wine cellar. It wasn't just a wine rack in the kitchen or a fancy cooler. Oh no, that would have been far too pedestrian for Julian. When we moved into our second apartment, the one he bought after a particularly lucrative year, a key criterion was a basement space that could be converted. He spent a fortune on it, hiring specialists to create a climate-controlled, cedar-lined sanctuary. It was his cathedral, his sacred space. A heavy darkwood door with the wrought iron handle and a complex, keypad lock guarded the entrance. Inside it was always a cool, still 55 degrees. The air smelled of damp earth, old wood, and the faint, ghostly perfume of vintages past. Rows upon rows of cedar racks held the bottles, each one lying on its side like a sleeping soldier. Soft, golden spotlights were angled to illuminate the labels, turning them into miniature works of art. This was Julian's true passion. Or, as I would later come to understand, his ultimate performance. He didn't just drink wine. He experienced it. He didn't just own it. He curated it. He spoke of his collection in reverent tones, using words like provenance, terroir, and verticals. He would spend hours in that cellar cataloging, reorganizing, or sometimes just standing there, gazing at his liquid assets with a look of paternal pride. In the beginning I found it romantic. He tried to teach me, to bring me into his world. He would open a bottle on a Saturday night, not just any bottle but something with a story. This, he'd announce, swirling a deep ruby liquid in a ridiculously large glass, is a 1990 Chateau Margaux. The growing season that year was almost perfect. A little bit of rain in August, but the harvest was sublime. Can you taste the blackcurrant, the violets, the hint of cigar box? I would dutifully sniff and sip. I think so, I'd murmur, trying to find the poetry he described. Mostly it just tasted like very good, very strong wine to me. But I wanted to share his passion. I read books, I watched documentaries, I learned the names of the regions Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhône Valley. I learned the difference between a Cabernet Sauvignon and a Pinot Noir. I learned to nod knowingly when he spoke of tannins and acidity. I became a good student. But slowly over time, I began to realize that my education was not for my own enrichment. It was for his. My role was not to be a fellow connoisseur, but to be an educated audience member, a supporting character in the grand drama of Julian and his magnificent wine. The lessons became lectures. The shared moments became examinations. "Ilara," he'd say, holding a glass out to me. "What are you getting on the nose?" I'd take a hesitant sniff. Cherry. Maybe some spice." He would sigh, a small theatrical puff of disappointment.
"No, darling.
It's not just cherry. It's morello cherry specifically. And that's not spice. That's star anise with a whisper of clove. You have to train your palate. It doesn't come naturally to everyone." The implication was always clear. It came naturally to him. He was born with a superior palate, a superior intellect, a superior understanding of the finer things in life. I was a novice, a charming simpleton he was attempting to elevate. The darling was the twist of the knife, the condescension wrapped in a silken ribbon of affection. The collection grew, and with it his arrogance. He acquired bottles that were legendary, bottles that cost more than my first car. A 1982 Petrus. A 1961 Oakbryan. A Screaming Eagle Cabernet from the 90s that he spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. These were not just for drinking. They were trophies. They were proof of his success, his taste, his superiority. He loved to show off the cellar to guests. This was the centerpiece of every dinner party. After the main course he would stand up and announce, "And now for something special." He would lead a procession down to the basement, his guests oohing and awing as he punched in the code and swung open the heavy door. He would walk them through the rows, pointing out his prized possessions, recounting the story of how he acquired each one. The stories were always dramatic, involving fierce bidding wars at auction, a chance encounter with a reclusive vineyard owner, or a clever negotiation with a rival collector. He was the hero of every tale. I would stand at the back of the group, a faint, polite smile fixed on my face, feeling a growing sense of alienation. I was watching a performance I had seen 100 times. I knew all the lines, all the dramatic pauses. And I knew that this collection, this dark, cold room, was more important to him than I was. A bottle of wine could be perfect. It had a vintage, a pedigree, a quantifiable value. Person, on the other hand, was messy. A person had their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own imperfect palate. The turning point, the moment the first crack appeared in the foundation of our relationship, was subtle. It was my 30th birthday. He threw a lavish party for me at our apartment. All his friends were there, all the people from his world. My own friends, a smaller, scruffier bunch of academics and artists, seemed out of place, like sparrows in a flock of peacocks. For my gift, Julian had promised something unforgettable. Throughout the evening he kept dropping hints. At the end of the night, when only the closest circle remained, he gathered everyone for the big reveal. He led me to the center of the room, his arm possessively around my waist. "My darling Ilara," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "You are the finest thing in my collection. To celebrate you, I thought it was only fitting to open something truly worthy of the occasion." He disappeared for a moment and returned from the cellar holding a single, dust-covered bottle. A murmur of appreciation went through the room. Even I, with my trained but uninspired palate, recognized the label. It was a Domaine de la Romanée Conti, A wine so rare and expensive it was practically mythical. It was the crown jewel of his collection. The one bottle he always said he was saving for the day he conquered the world. He made a great show of opening it, using a special two-pronged corkscrew, his movements precise and theatrical. He poured a small amount into a glass and handed it to me. "Happy birthday, my love." I took a sip. It was, I had to admit, extraordinary. It was complex and silky, a tapestry of flavors that I couldn't even begin to name. It felt ancient and alive at the same time. But as I drank it, a cold feeling washed over me. I looked at Julian and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his friends, his expression a mixture of magnanimity and triumph. He had not opened this wine for me. He had opened it for them. He had used my birthday as an excuse to display his ultimate trophy. I was not the occasion. I was the pretext. I was an accessory to the wine, not the other way around. The rest of the evening is a blur of false smiles and hollow thank yous. When everyone had finally left, and we were standing in the wreckage of the party, surrounded by empty glasses and plates, I tried to voice my feelings. "Julian," I started, my voice small. "That was an incredible gesture. But that wine, it felt less like a gift for me, and more like a performance for your friends." He turned to me, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What are you talking about? It's the best wine in the world. I opened the best for you. How can that be a bad thing? Don't be ungrateful, Ilara." Ungrateful. The word hung in the air between us, cold and sharp. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. To him, value was objective. The most expensive wine was the greatest expression of love. The idea that the sentiment, the intention, could matter more than the price tag was a foreign concept. He saw my hurt not as a valid emotional response, but as a flaw in my character. I was failing to appreciate the magnitude of his generosity. I went to bed that night feeling a profound and desolate loneliness. I lay there in the dark in his perfectly designed apartment, in his perfectly curated life, and I realized I was just another object in his collection. The most valuable, perhaps. The one he showed off the most. But an object nonetheless. And objects don't have feelings. Objects are just meant to be admired. That was the night the first seed of rebellion was planted. It was a tiny bitter seed. But it found fertile ground in the dark, quiet soil of my disillusionment. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me, that one day I would have to reclaim something of myself from him. One day I would have to shatter the illusion. The months that followed my 30th birthday were a slow, grinding decline. The incident with the Romani Conti had created a hairline fracture in my perception of our life together, and with every subsequent interaction, the crack widened, splintering until the entire facade was a web of fissures. I started to see his condescension not as an occasional lapse, but as the fundamental grammar of our relationship. His lessons on wine became unbearable. He would quiz me in front of our friends, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Ilara, tell David why this Sancerre is so much more expressive than the Paoli fume we had last week." I would stumble through an answer, pieced together from things he had told me, feeling like a schoolgirl reciting a memorized poem. If I got it right, he would nod with the air of a proud teacher. "See? She's learning." If I got it wrong, he would chuckle and correct me gently, but the gentleness was a performance for the audience. The message to me was clear. You are still not good enough. His dismissiveness began to bleed into other areas of my life, particularly my work. My doctorate, which he once touted as my secret weapon of culture, was now treated as a quaint, slightly embarrassing hobby. I would be deep in research, surrounded by books and papers, trying to unravel the complex patronage networks of 17th century Rome, a topic that fascinated me to my core. He would walk in, glance at the mess on the dining table and sigh. "Still playing with your dusty old books, darling? Did you remember to call the caterer for Saturday's party?" The transition was seamless. My intellectual passion was playing. His social obligations were the real work. One evening I was excitedly telling him about a breakthrough I'd had. A letter I'd unearthed in a digital archive that connected a minor artist to a major cardinal, potentially recontextualizing a whole series of paintings. I was speaking quickly, the words tumbling out in my enthusiasm. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through stock market updates. When I finished, breathless, he looked up, his eyes unfocused. "That's nice, Ilara. Really? Hey, did you see that tech stock I told you about is up 12%? He hadn't heard a word. Or if he had, it had registered as meaningless background noise, like the hum of the refrigerator. My triumph, a moment of pure academic joy that had been weeks in the making, was reduced to static. I felt my excitement curdle into a familiar, sour mix of shame and anger. I quietly cleared my books from the table, my silence a stark contrast to my earlier ebullience. He didn't notice. The wine cellar remained his sanctuary, and it became an ever more potent symbol of our disconnect. He began acquiring wines not just from auction houses, but directly from contacts in Europe. He would have crates shipped over, insulated boxes filled with treasures he had discovered. The process of their arrival was a grand ritual. He would track the shipment online, and on the day of delivery he would work from home waiting impatiently. When the boxes arrived, he would have them brought directly to the foyer. He would open them with the reverence of an archaeologist unsealing a pharaoh's tomb. He would lift each bottle out, wipe the condensation from the glass, and read the label aloud, his voice filled with awe. A vertical of Chateau d'Yquem from 88, 89, and the legendary 90. Unbelievable. My role in this ritual was to be the appreciative onlooker. I was expected to share in his excitement, to gasp at the right moments, to affirm the genius of his acquisitions. Wow, Julian. That's amazing. I would say, my voice flat. One day, a crate arrived that was particularly special. It contained 6 bottles of a rare Burgundy, a Clos de Tart Grand Cru. He had been hunting it for years. As he was unboxing it, one of the bottles slipped from his grasp. It was only for a fraction of a second. He was standing on a thick rug, and he managed to catch it against his leg, stopping its fall. It didn't break. Didn't even clink. But for a split second the universe held its breath. The color drained from his face. He clutched the bottle to his chest, his knuckles white. He was breathing heavily. I rushed forward, concerned. Are you okay? He looked at me, but his eyes were wild, unseeing. Do you have any idea? He whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying intensity. What would have happened if that had broken? Do you have any idea the value, the history that would have been lost? He wasn't worried about being hurt. He wasn't relieved that he was safe. His terror was entirely for the object. In that moment I saw him with the dreadful absolute clarity. If our apartment were on fire, and he had time to save only one thing, me or that bottle of Clos de Tart, I honestly wasn't sure which one he would choose. The thought was so cold, so monstrous that it made me physically sick. I backed away slowly. I'm glad you're okay, Julian, I said, and fled to the bedroom, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling. This wasn't love. This was obsession. This was a pathology dressed up in a tuxedo. He didn't collect wine. He collected status symbols, and he guarded them with a ferocity he never showed for me. This incident became the final straw, the catalyst for what was to come. It wasn't a loud, dramatic fight. It was a quiet internal shift. The part of me that had been making excuses for him, that had been clinging to the memory of the charming man I first met, simply died. It withered and turned to dust. In its place, something new began to grow. Something cold and patient and methodical. He was planning a party. Of course he was. But this was not just any party. This was the party. The one he had been talking about for months. Julian was on the cusp of a major deal. A partnership with a legendary, almost mythical investor named Alastair Finch. Finch was old money, a man whose family had been wealthy for generations. He was known to be a connoisseur of the highest order, a man who could not be impressed by flashy displays of new money, but only by true substance, true taste. Julian was obsessed with impressing this man. Finch was the ultimate validation. If he could win over Alastair Finch, it would prove that he, Julian, was not just some vulgar upstart, but a man of genuine class and sophistication. The entire party was being orchestrated around Finch's tastes. The food was being catered by a Michelin-starred chef. A string quartet was hired to play Bartók, Finch's favorite composer. And the centerpiece, the coup de grace, was to be the wine. Julian had been planning the flight for weeks. It was to be a tour de force of his collection. He would start with a rare vintage champagne, move to a legendary white Burgundy, and then for the main event, he would serve a side-by-side tasting of 2 of his most prized Bordeaux, the 1982 Petrus and the 1961 Haut-Brion. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, serving 2 of the most iconic wines ever made in a single evening. It was designed to be a shock and awe campaign of enological brilliance. Finch will be speechless, Julian would say, his eyes gleaming with manic excitement. He'll see that I'm not just another suit. He'll see that I understand legacy, that I appreciate history. This deal will be signed before the dessert course is even served. He talked about it incessantly. He would pull me into the cellar and show me the bottles again and again, as if for the first time. Look at them, Alara. The 82 Petrus, the King of Pomerol, and the 61 O'Brien. A perfect bottle. The Ullage is magnificent. Ullage, the little gap of air between the cork and the wine. One of the dozens of useless, pretentious words I had learned from him. As I listened to him, as I watched him preen and posture, the seed of an idea began to sprout in my mind. It was a wicked, audacious, and utterly terrifying idea. It felt like a bolt of lightning, illuminating the dark landscape of my resentment with a sudden, brilliant clarity. What was the source of his power over me, over everyone? It was this collection, this liquid fortress of arrogance. It was the foundation upon which he built his entire identity. What if that foundation was not as solid as he believed? What if it was, in fact, nothing more than juice? The thought made me laugh, a real genuine laugh for the first time in months. The sheer beautiful simplicity of it. It wasn't about destruction. It was about substitution. It was about replacing the sacred with the profane, the priceless with the worthless, all while leaving the glittering facade perfectly intact. He wouldn't just be embarrassed. He would be undone. His entire performance of sophistication would be exposed as a sham in front of the one man he desperately needed to impress. He would be revealed not as a connoisseur, but as a fool who couldn't tell the difference between a legendary Bordeaux and a carton of Welch's. The plan began to take shape, not in a flurry of angry scribbles, but in the quiet, methodical way I approached my own research. I became an academic of retribution. My thesis was Julian's downfall, and I would pursue it with scholarly rigor. The party was 3 weeks away. I had time, but I had to be perfect. There could be no mistakes, no trace of my involvement. The revenge had to be as elegant and subtle as the wines themselves. It had to be a masterpiece of deception. And so, my own private, obsessive collection began. The genesis of a plan like this is not a single, explosive moment of inspiration. It is a slow crystallization of thought, an idea that starts as a formless, hazy notion and gradually sharpens into focus. My idotto replaced Julian's priceless wine with grape juice was, at its core, a simple one. A child's prank almost. But the execution, I knew, had to be anything but simple. It required the precision of a surgeon, the patience of a historian, and the guile of a spy. My first challenge was logistical, access. The cellar was Julian's fortress, protected by a keypad lock. I knew the code, of course. He had told it to me in the early trusting days of our relationship. It was 1855, the year of the Bordeaux wine official classification. Pretentious, predictable, and, for me, utterly perfect. He had never considered changing it because he had never considered me a threat. In his mind, I was part of the collection, not a risk to it. His arrogance was my key. The second challenge was the substance itself. I couldn't just use any grape juice. The color, the clarity, the viscosity, it all had to be right. A 1982 Petrus is not the same color as a 1961 O'Brien. One is a deep, opulent, almost blackish ruby, while the other, being older, would have a more garnet, brick-red hue at the rim. Young white burgundies are pale gold. Older ones deepen into a rich, burnished amber. I couldn't afford a single misstep. Julian, for all his flaws, knew his wines. He would spot an incorrect shade in an instant. My research began not in the library but in the grocery store. I spent hours in the juice aisle, a strange new academic pursuit. I became a connoisseur of Concord, a specialist in Niagara, a maven of Merlot juice. I bought dozens of different brands and types: white grape, red grape, blends, organic, from concentrate, not from concentrate. I turned our kitchen, the one he had designed for minimalist entertaining, into a laboratory. I set up a row of wine glasses on the counter. I would pour a small amount of a specific juice into a glass and hold it up to the light, studying its color and opacity. I'd swirl it, watching the way it clung to the glass, the legs, as Julian would call them. Most juices were too thin, too watery. They lacked the body, the weight of a fine wine. I started experimenting with blends. A splash of blackcurrant juice to deepen the color of a standard red grape juice. A tiny, almost homeopathic drop of black food coloring to mimic the inky darkness of a young Cabernet. For the whites, it was even trickier. I found that a mix of white grape juice with a hint of apple juice and a single drop of strongly brewed black tea could create a convincing golden hue that mimicked an aged Chardonnay. It was a culinary alchemy, a dark art. I kept meticulous notes in a small plain notebook, a catalogue of my fraudulent vintages. Recipe for young Bordeaux: 3 parts Concord grape, 1 part black cherry, 2 drops blue food coloring per liter. It was insane and it was glorious. The next and most formidable challenge was the bottles and corks. I couldn't just open his priceless bottles, pour out the wine and refill them. The corks would be destroyed. A true connoisseur like Alistair Finch would examine the cork. It had to be the original cork or a perfect aged facsimile, branded with the chateau's name. And the foil capsule covering the cork had to be seamless, undisturbed. This is where my art history background became unexpectedly useful. I was trained to look for forgeries, to understand the craft of replication. I spent a week of late nights after Julian was asleep, watching videos made by wine counterfeiters and restorers. I learned about a tool called an osso, a two-pronged device that could, with great care, ease an old fragile cork out of a bottle without piercing it. I ordered one online, along with a wine bottle recorking device and a case of unbranded, high-quality corks for practice. I also needed empty bottles, identical to the ones in the cellar, on which to practice my techniques. This was a delicate operation. I couldn't just go out and buy them. I had to acquire them naturally. Over the next 2 weeks, I steered our own casual wine consumption towards the right shapes. Julian, darling, I'd say, I'm making cocoa vin tonight. We need a burgundy, don't we? I would then carefully save the empty bottle, cleaning it meticulously. I acquired a Bordeaux bottle, a burgundy bottle, and a champagne bottle, my secret training dummies. The most difficult part was the foil capsule. Once removed, it is almost impossible to put back on without showing creases or wrinkles. I discovered that with a very sharp craft knife, I could slice the very top of the capsule off, a perfect little circle, leaving the rest of it intact around the bottle's neck. I could then extract the cork, do my work, and insert a new clean cork. The final touch would be to seal the top with wax, a practice used by some wineries and collectors to protect old corks. It would look like a deliberate protective measure. I bought blocks of deep red and dark gold sealing wax, the kind used for antique letters. My practice sessions were conducted in the dead of night. I would wait until I heard the deep, steady rhythm of Julian's breathing from the bedroom. Then I would creep out into the living room, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I'd spread a towel on the dining table and set up my strange equipment. The empty bottles, the osso, the corker, my little pots of custom-blended juice, a funnel, and the wax. The first few attempts were clumsy failures. I shredded a cork with the osso. I spilled grape juice. My first wax seal was a lumpy, ugly mess. But I am by nature a patient person. My academic work taught me the value of persistence. Night after night I practiced. I learned the precise angle and pressure to use with the osso, a gentle rocking motion that coaxed the cork out whole. I learned to pour the juice with a steady hand, using a narrow funnel to avoid a single drop on the bottle's rim. I mastered the recorker, a levered device that required a surprising amount of force to drive the new cork in smoothly and evenly. And I perfected the wax seal. I learned to melt the wax to the exact right temperature, to pour it in a single confident motion, and to give it a slight tilt as it cooled to create a smooth, glossy, professional-looking cap. After a week of practice, I could take an empty bottle, fill it, cork it, and seal it in under 10 minutes, leaving it looking authentic, even under close inspection. During this time, my demeanor around Julian changed. I had to become the greatest actress of my life. I leaned into the role he had written for me. I became more attentive, more admiring. I would ask him questions about the wines for the party, my eyes wide with feigned innocence. Julian, tell me again about the Petrus. What makes it so special? And he, basking in what he saw as my renewed adoration, would lecture me for an hour. He was so consumed by his own monologue, so blinded by his own brilliance, that he never noticed the glint in my eye, the quiet calculation behind my smile. He was, in essence, providing me with the final details for my masterpiece. He was describing the victim to the assassin. The color Ilara, he said one evening, swirling an imaginary glass. The 82 is still so incredibly deep and purple, almost opaque. It's a monster of a wine. But the 61 O'Brien is different. It's had more time. You'll see more garnet, more bricking at the edge. It's the color of old velvet. I scribbled this down in my memory, filed it away. Old velvet. I could replicate old velvet. The final piece of the puzzle was choosing the exact bottles to target. I couldn't replace the entire cellar. That would be impossible and unnecessary. The revenge needed to be a surgical strike, not a carpet bombing. The impact had to be concentrated on the night of the party. He had selected 6 wines for the evening. 1. I 2008 Salons Le Mesnil Blanc de Blanc Champagne. 2. I 2014 Cocheterie Corton Charlemagne Grand Cru, the White Burgundy. 3. A 1990 Chateau Margaux. 4. The 1982 Chateau Petrus. 5. The 1961 Chateau Haut-Brion. 6. A 1988 Chateau d'Yquem for dessert. 6 legendary bottles. 6 pillars of his pride. These would be my targets. I memorized their locations in the cellar, their exact rack and bin numbers. The Petrus and the Haut-Brion were in a special, glass-fronted display section at the very back, the altar of his church. The night before I planned to execute the operation, I lay in bed, my mind a whirlwind of checklists and anxieties. What if he decided to go into the cellar for some reason? What if I dropped a bottle? What if the color was wrong? The what-ifs were a swarm of angry bees in my head. But underneath the fear, there was a profound, exhilarating calm. I was no longer the passive audience to his grand performance. I was the director of the final act. I was the ghostwriter finishing his story. I looked over at him, sleeping beside me. His face, so handsome in repose, seemed like a mask. The man I thought I knew was a fiction, a character he played. The real Julian was the one who trembled for a bottle of wine. And tomorrow I would introduce that man to the world. The day of the swap 2 days before the party was a masterclass in controlled anxiety. Julian had an all-day series of meetings off-site, a pre-Finch summit, as he called it. He left early in the morning, dressed in his corporate armor of a perfectly tailored suit, his mind already on the prize. Don't forget the florist comes at 10, and the rental company with the extra glasses is at noon, he said, kissing me distractedly on the cheek. His kiss felt like a brush of dry leaves. The moment the front door clicked shut, the quiet of the apartment became electric. My own home was now enemy territory, the stage for my quiet coup. I stood still for a full minute, just breathing, my heart a frantic, pulsing thing in my chest. This was it. There was no turning back. My first step was to prepare my vintages. The kitchen became my illicit winery. I lined up 6 empty, sterilized wine bottles, me practice dummies, now ready for their starring role. I consulted my little notebook, my grimoire of fraudulent recipes. For the salon champagne, the challenge was bubbles. I couldn't use actual sparkling cider, it would be too sweet, and the bubbles would be too coarse. My solution was a mixture of white grape juice, a touch of pear juice for dryness, and a hit of unflavored sparkling water, to be added at the very last second before corking. For the Koschduri, the legendary white burgundy, I had my perfected blend. A high-quality white grape juice, a whisper of chamomile tea for that aged, golden color and a hint of a floral note on the nose, and a squeeze of lemon juice to mimic the acidity. The reds were the true test. The 90 Margaux required a deep but still vibrant ruby. My notes dictated a blend of dark grape juice, a little pomegranate for tannins and tartness, and a touch of blackcurrant. I tasted it. It was plausible. For the 2 titans, the Petrus and the Haut-Brion, I had to be a true artist. Julian's words echoed in my head. The 82 Petrus. A monster. Deep and purple, almost opaque. For this, I used the darkest Concord grape juice I could find, adding a minuscule, almost molecular amount of blue and black food coloring, until it was the color of a starless midnight sky. For the 61 Haut-Brion, garnet, bricking at the edge, the color of old velvet. This was my masterpiece. I used a base of red grape juice, but I steeped it for an hour with a bag of hibiscus tea, which gave it a beautiful, soft, reddish-brown tint. I then added a drop or 2 of beet juice to get the perfect, aged garnet hue. I lined up the 6 prepared bottles, my fraudulent flight, on the kitchen counter. They looked strangely beautiful, a rainbow of deceit. Now for the cellar. I walked to the basement door, my hands slick with sweat. I punched in the code 1-8-5-5 and the lock beeped its consent. The heavy door swung open with a soft sigh, releasing a wave of cool, earthy air. The smell, which I had once found romantic, now smelled like a tomb. I carried a soft-sided cooler bag with my tools and the replacement bottles. I also brought a small, battery-powered lamp, as I didn't want to risk turning on the main spotlights and drawing attention. The cellar was dark, silent, and cold. The rows of sleeping bottles felt like witnesses, their glass eyes watching my every move. My plan was to work from the least valuable to the most valuable, leaving the 2 main event bottles for last. I started with the Chateau d'Yquem, the dessert wine. It was on a lower rack near the door. My hands were trembling so much I could barely handle the asso. I took a deep breath, picturing Julian's smug face as he lectured me. The anger steadied my hands. I carefully sliced the top of the foil capsule with my craft knife, peeling it back like the lid on a tiny tin can. The cork was old and soft. I inserted the 2 prongs of the asso, one on each side of the cork, and gently rocked it back and forth. It began to move. Millimeter by millimeter, I coaxed it out. It came free with a soft, satisfying sigh. The smell of the real dechem filled the air for a moment, a glorious scent of honey, apricot, and saffron. It was a crime to dispose of it, a small part of me thought. No, I corrected myself. The crime was what it represented. I carefully poured the priceless liquid into one of my empty practice bottles, which I would dispose of later. Then, using my funnel, I filled the original dechem bottle with my own concoct-Iona blend of white grape juice and a thick syrupy peach nectar. The color was a perfect match. I slid a fresh, unmarked cork into my hand corker, placed it over the bottle and pulled the lever. The cork slid home snug and secure. The final touch, the wax. I lit a small butane torch, the kind used for creme brulee, and melted the gold wax, dripping it carefully over the new cork, creating a smooth, unblemished seal. I placed the violated bottle back in its cradle. It looked perfect, untouched. My heart was hammering, but a surge of triumph washed through me. I could do this. One by one I worked my way through the list. The Chateau Margaux. The cork was firm. The wine, a deep river of crimson, swirled down the drain of my empty bottle. In its place went my pomegranate-laced impostor. The Coche d'Oeuvre. The pale gold liquid was replaced by my tea-stained brew. The Salon Champagne. This was the trickiest. I had to work fast. I uncorked it, the pop muffled by the seller's silence. I poured out the legendary champagne and quickly funneled in my grape juice blend. At the last second, I topped it off with the sparkling water and immediately corked it, trapping the fizz inside. It wouldn't hold for long, but it only needed to last 2 days. I even managed to find a blank foil capsule and a wire cage online, which I secured over the new cork. It looked uncannily authentic. 4 down. 2 to go. The Holy of Holies. The 82 Petrus and the 61 O'Brien. I moved to the back of the cellar, to the glass-fronted display case where they lay in honored repose. My hands were steady now. My fear had been replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I felt like I was performing a sacred rite, an exorcism. I started with the O'Brien. The cork was ancient, fragile. I eased it out with the care of a bomb disposal expert. The wine that I poured away was the color of history. It smelled of earth and leather and time itself. I replaced it with my old velvet juice. I corked it, sealed it with deep red wax, and gently placed it back. Finally, the Petrus. The king. Julien's ultimate trophy. I lifted the heavy bottle. It felt like I was holding his heart in my hands. I uncorked it. The wine inside was so dark it was almost black, just as he had described. It smelled of dark fruit and truffles and immense, concentrated power. For a moment I hesitated. This felt like a point of no return, not just for my relationship but for my own soul. Was I becoming as monstrous as him? Then I remembered his face when he almost dropped the Classe de Tarte. The terror in his eyes, a terror he never showed for me. I remembered every casual dismissal, every condescending darling. Every time he made me feel small and stupid. My resolve hardened like steel. I poured the king down the drain. In its place I funneled my inky, opaque midnight sky juice. Corked it. I sealed it with the same red wax. I placed it back in its cradle next to its desecrated brother. I stood back and looked at my work. 6 bottles sitting in their racks, looking for all the world like 6 of the most revered wines on the planet. But I knew the truth. They were shells. They were beautiful, expensive lies. They were hollowed-out symbols, their power drained, their magic replaced by sugar and food coloring. I gathered my tools, my empty bottles filled with the now worthless nectar of the gods. I cleaned every surface, wiped away any trace of my presence. I left the cellar exactly as I had found it, turning off my small lamp and letting the profound darkness swallow the room again. As I closed the heavy door and heard the lock click into place, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had not destroyed his collection. I had redefined it. I disposed of the real wine and my equipment in a public trash bin several blocks away, dumping the bag in with a final decisive thud. When Julien came home that evening, he was buzzing with energy, high on his own ambition. The meetings were incredible, Alara. They're primed. Finch is going to be putty in my hands. That's wonderful, darling, I said, handing him a glass of water. Later that night he said, I'm just going to go down and check on the soldiers. Make sure they're ready for the big day. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, my entire body tensed. He walked to the cellar door, punched in the code and disappeared inside. I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. Felt like an eternity. He was in there for maybe 3 minutes. He emerged with a beatific smile on his face. Perfect, he said, rubbing his hands together. Absolutely perfect. They are sleeping beauties, just waiting for their prince to awaken them. I smiled back, a slow, genuine smile. I can't wait, I said. And I meant it. The day of the party was a symphony of controlled chaos, and I was its silent conductor. While Julian strode around the apartment, a general surveying his battlefield on the eve of victory, I moved through the space with a serene, almost detached calm. The florist arrived with sprays of white orchids, stark and elegant. The caterers bustled in and out of the kitchen, their quiet professionalism a stark contrast to Julian's nervous energy. The string quartet was setting up in the corner, tuning their instruments with soft, discordant plucks that seemed to mirror the tension in the air. I was playing the role of the perfect hostess, a part one had been rehearsing for years. I smiled, I gave instructions, I made sure everyone had what they needed. But inside I was a silent observer, a spectator at my own creation. My mind was a split screen. On one side, I was managing the logistics of the evening. On the other, I was replaying the scene in the cellar, the dark ritual of the swap, the glint of the fraudulent juices in their hallowed bottles. Julian was a marvel of preening anxiety. He changed his tie 3 times. He rearranged the art on the walls. He kept pacing to the cellar door, not entering, but just placing his hand on it, as if to draw strength from the treasures within. Alistair Finch is a man of immense subtlety, Alara. He instructed me for the dozenth time, adjusting his cufflinks in the hall mirror. Don't try to talk to him about art. It will come across as amateurish. Just smile and look beautiful. Let me handle the substance. Of course, darling, I said, my voice smooth as silk. I felt no anger, no sting. His words were like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. He was so busy building his own legend, he couldn't see the woman who was about to dismantle it. The guests began to arrive at 7. They were Julian's crowd. Hedge fund managers with predatory smiles, tech entrepreneurs who spoke in a jargon of disruption and scalability, and their wives, women who were as beautifully curated as our apartment. The air filled with the murmur of expensive chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the scent of money and perfume. Then at 7:30 precisely, Alistair Finch arrived. He was not what I expected. I had pictured a formidable, intimidating tycoon. But the man who entered was small, almost bird-like, with a shock of white hair and bright, intelligent blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a simple, impeccably cut tweed jacket that looked older than I was. He moved with a quiet, unassuming grace, a stark contrast to Julian's desperate-to-impress energy. Julian swooped in immediately, his smile wide and dazzling. Alistair, welcome, welcome. I'm so glad you could make it. Julian, Finch said, his voice a dry, gentle rasp. He shook Julian's hand, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the string quartet, the orchids, the other guests. You've gone to a great deal of trouble. There was no judgment in his voice, merely observation. Only the best for you, Alistair, Julian boomed. He guided Finch over to me. And this is my brilliant partner, Alara. Finch took my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm. He looked me directly in the eye, and for a moment I felt a flicker of panic. It felt as though his piercing blue eyes could see right through me, down to the very core of my secret. A pleasure, Alara, he said. Julian tells me you're an art historian. A noble pursuit. So much more lasting than the ephemera we deal in. I was so taken aback by his direct, respectful address that I almost forgot my lines. Julian shot me a warning look, a micro-expression that said, remember what I told you. I smiled at Finch. It has its moments, I said simply. The first part of the evening went according to Julian's script. The string quartet played Bartok. The canapés were exquisite. Julian stayed glued to Alistair Finch's side, pontificating on the market, on politics, on his own brilliant strategies. Finch listened politely, nodding, asking the occasional, incisive question that seemed to subtly deflate Julian's pomposity, though Julian himself was too high on his own performance to notice. I did not go near them. I floated through the party, a ghost in my own home. I watched from a distance, my stomach a tight knot of anticipation. This part of the night felt interminable, a long, slow climb up the first hill of a roller coaster. Finally, dinner was served. The guests took their seats around the long, beautifully set dining table. The first course arrived, and with it the first test. Julian stood up, tapping his glass for attention. His face was flushed with excitement. My friends and our esteemed guest of honor, Alistair. To begin our journey tonight, I thought we'd start with something truly special. A toast to new partnerships and old traditions. He nodded to the hired waiter, who emerged from the kitchen holding the first bottle, the 2008 Ceylon champagne. It looked magnificent in the ice bucket, its label gleaming. My heart leaped into my throat. The bubbles. Had the bubbles survived? The waiter expertly popped the cork. It gave a satisfying festive pop. So far so good. He poured a small amount for Julian to taste. Julian swirled it, sniffed it, and took a sip. I watched his face, every muscle, every nerve. He paused. He frowned for a fraction of a second. I felt a wave of cold dread. Did he know? Was it over before it even began? Then, his expression cleared, and he nodded magnanimously at the waiter. Excellent. Please serve our guests. I exhaled slowly. He hadn't noticed. Of course he hadn't. He wasn't tasting the wine. The waiter moved around the table, pouring the fizzy, pear-scented grape juice into the flutes. A murmur of appreciation went through the room. Solano ate. Incredible, Julian! Someone exclaimed. The dinner progressed. The second wine was brought out, the Coche de Courtin Charlemagne. Again Julian went through his tasting ritual. He swirled the glass, noting the beautiful deep golden color. He sniffed it, proclaiming, "Ah, that classic Coche nose. Gunflint, toasted nuts, a hint of citrus." He was smelling a ghost, a memory of what he thought should be there. He was tasting my concoction of grape juice and chamomile tea, and declaring it a masterpiece. Again, Finch sniffed the wine, swirled it, and set it down without drinking. He was eating his food, engaging in polite conversation with the woman next to him, but his wine glasses, both the champagne and the white, remained full, untouched. And now it was time for the main event, the crescendo. Julian stood up again, his voice trembling with barely suppressed glee. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the real reason we are all here tonight. A confrontation of titans. A battle of legends. From the right bank, the powerhouse, the king of Pomerol. The 1982 Chateau Petrus. A waiter appeared, presenting the bottle with the reverence due a holy relic. The red wax seal I had so carefully applied gleamed under the candlelight. And from the left bank, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. The epitome of elegance, a true monument of a vintage. The 1961 Chateau O'Brien. A second waiter appeared with the other bottle, its identical red wax seal a mirror image of the first. There were audible gasps from the guests. It was an obscene display of wealth and ego, and they were eating it up. We are going to taste them side by side, Julian announced. An experience few people on this earth will ever have. The ritual of decanting began. 2 beautiful crystal decanters were brought out. The waiters, under Julian's hawk-like supervision, carefully opened the bottles. The Osso corkscrews I had seen in his drawer were used. My fake wax seals were scraped away. My replacement corks were eased out. It was all going perfectly. The fraudulent wines were poured into the decanters. My Midnight Sky Petrus juice looked dark and menacing. My Old Velvet O'Brien juice had a softer brick red glow. The colors were, I had to admit, spot on. The waiters began to serve, pouring a small amount of each wine into 2 separate, enormous glasses at each place setting. The table fell silent. The only sound was the liquid pouring into the glasses and the soft music from the string quartet. Julian raised his first glass, the Petrus. To legacy, he said, his eyes fixed on Alistair Finch. He swirled the opaque liquid. He buried his nose in the glass. Incredible, he breathed. The power. Dark chocolate, truffle, black licorice. It's all there. A perfect bottle. He took a sip. He closed his eyes in ecstasy. His performance was magnificent. He was Laurence Olivier playing the role of a wine connoisseur. He then picked up the second glass, the O'Brien. He swirled it. And the elegance, he murmured. So different. Cigar box, cedar, dried flowers. The smell of history. He took a sip of that one too, a thoughtful expression on his face. Remarkable. 2 completely different philosophies of greatness side by side. Alistair, what are your thoughts? All eyes turned to the small, white-haired man at the head of the table. The entire evening, the entire deal, hinged on this moment. Alistair Finch had not touched his glasses. He simply sat there looking at the 2 dark liquids. He picked up the glass of Petrus. He did not swirl it. He did not sniff it. He simply looked at it. He did the same with the O'Brien. He then placed them both down. He folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Julian. A faint, gentle smile touched his lips. Julian, he said, his quiet voice cutting through the reverent silence of the room like a shard of glass. An interesting choice. Julian beamed, preening. I thought you'd appreciate it. Oh, I do, Finch said, his blue eyes twinkling with a strange light. I appreciate the gesture. But I must confess, I have a rather pedestrian palate. He paused, letting the silence stretch. This Petrus, he said, gesturing to the glass, reminds me quite vividly of the Welch's grape juice my nanny used to give me as a boy. The silence in the room was no longer reverent. It was a solid physical thing. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. Someone coughed. Julian's smile froze on his face. It was a horrifying sight. A rictus of joy that had died but hadn't yet been told to fall. What? Alistair, you old joker, he stammered, his laugh a high, brittle thing. Finch's smile did not waver. And the oat, Brian, he continued, his voice relentlessly gentle, is a little more complex. It has a distinct note of. I believe it's the Knutson family organic blend. My grandchildren are quite fond of it. He then picked up his water glass, took a small, deliberate sip and looked at Julian. The kindness had gone from his eyes. They were now as cold and clear as ice. The room erupted in a chaos of whispers. People were picking up their glasses, sniffing them with confused expressions. A man sitting near me took a hesitant sip of the Petrus, and his eyes went wide. He quickly put the glass down as if it were poison. Julian's face went through a rapid, terrifying series of transformations. The frozen smile cracked, replaced by utter confusion. Confusion gave way to dawning horror. Horror curdled into pure, incandescent rage. His face turned a blotchy, furious red. His eyes darted around the table, seeing the looks of pity and barely concealed mockery on the faces of his guests. His entire world, the carefully constructed edifice of his superiority, had been demolished in 2 sentences. He snatched his glass, took a large, clumsy gulp of the Petrus, and his expression confirmed everything. The taste of cheap, sugary grape juice, where he had just proclaimed he'd found chocolate and truffle, was a brutal physical shock. He sputtered, choking on the lie. His wild eyes scanned the room and finally landed on me. I was sitting perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I was not smiling. I was not gloating. My expression was one of calm, serene neutrality. I simply met his gaze. And in that moment he knew. He didn't know how, but he knew who. He saw the quiet, dismissed woman he had molded into an audience member, and he finally understood that she had been writing the script all along. The story did not end with a dramatic confrontation. Julian was too much of a coward for that. The aftermath was a series of echoes, the sound of a hollow man collapsing in on himself. Alistair Finch, with an impeccable sense of timing, stood up. "Julian," he said, placing his napkin on the table. "Thank you for a most memorable evening. I'm afraid I must be going." He nodded to me from across the room. "Alara, a pleasure." And then he was gone, leaving a vacuum of pure humiliation in his wake. His departure was the signal for a general exodus. The guests, with mumbled excuses and averted eyes, fled the scene of the disaster as if escaping a toxic spill. Within 15 minutes, the apartment was empty, save for the 2 of us, the bewildered caterers, and the string quartet, who had awkwardly trailed off mid-sonata. We were left in the ruins. The long table was a landscape of abandoned plates and half-empty glasses filled with my fraudulent concoctions. The white orchids seemed to mock us with their pristine beauty. Julian stood by the table, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trembling, not with rage anymore but with a kind of systemic shock. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He stared at the 2 decanters of dark juice as if they were venomous snakes. "How?" he finally whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The act itself was the only statement that mattered. I stood up, walked to our bedroom and closed the door. I had a bag packed, of course. I had been planning my departure with the same meticulous care as the rest of it. I sat on the bed and listened to the sounds from the other room. There was a crash, the sound of a glass being thrown against a wall. Then another. Then a great shattering roar as he swept a row of glasses from the table. It was the sound of a toddler having a tantrum. A wild, impotent explosion of fury. It was the sound of his powerlessness. I waited until the smashing stopped, replaced by a heavy, defeated silence. Then I picked up my bag, walked out of the bedroom and past him. He was standing amidst the wreckage, his suit jacket askew, his face pale and slack. He looked small. Stripped of his props, his expensive wines, his fawning audience, there was nothing left of him. He was just a hollow man in a beautifully decorated room. He didn't try to stop me. He just watched me go. The final communication I received from him came about an hour later, as I was sitting in a quiet, anonymous hotel room, the first one I had booked for myself in years. My phone buzzed. It was a voicemail. I almost deleted it, but curiosity, a final academic impulse, got the better of me. I pressed play. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't rage. It was worse. It was his voice stripped of all its polished charm, all its booming confidence. It was a thin, reedy, whining sound. Alara. Why? He began, his voice cracking. The Petrus. The O'Brien. The Salon. All of them? All of them? Do you know what you did? It wasn't just the party. It wasn't just Finch. You destroyed them. You poured them out, didn't you? You poured history down the drain. You poured my entire collection, my life's work, down the drain. How could you be so barbaric? And that was it. That was the last word he ever spoke to me. Barbaric. I listened to the message twice. He wasn't asking why I had left him. He wasn't asking about the years of condescension, the slow death of our love. He didn't mention my name again. His entire anguish, his entire sense of violation, was reserved for the wine. He mourned the loss of the objects, not the loss of the person. He confirmed in his own final pathetic words that I had been right all along. I deleted the message. I blocked his number. I felt a profound, cleansing sense of release. The revenge was never truly about the grape juice. That was just the medium, the paint I used to create my masterpiece. The revenge was about holding up a mirror to him. A mirror that didn't reflect the charming, sophisticated connoisseur he pretended to be, but the hollow, insecure man who used expensive objects as a substitute for a soul. I took the crown jewels of his kingdom, the symbols of his power, and I revealed them to be nothing more than sugary water. And in doing so, I revealed him to be nothing more than a man in an emperor's new clothes. The beauty of it was that he did it to himself. He was the one who proclaimed the greatness of the juice. He was the one who, with his own mouth, declared his palate a fraud. I just poured the glasses. He was the author of his own humiliation. I never saw him again. I heard, through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances who slowly trickled back to my side, that the Finch deal had evaporated, of course. His reputation in that small gossipy world was shattered. He became a laughingstock, a cautionary tale. The guy who thought Welch's was Petrus. He eventually sold the apartment and the remains of his collection. The real bottles I had left untouched and moved away. I finished my doctorate. I got a job as a curator at a small but respected museum. My life is quiet now, and it is my own. It is filled with things that have real intrinsic value to me. The smell of old books, the beauty of a perfectly rendered shadow in a 17th century painting, the comfortable silence of my own small apartment. I sometimes drink wine, but it's usually a simple, inexpensive bottle that I share with friends. We don't talk about its terroir or its tannins. We just talk. We laugh. We connect. The memory of Julian and his cellar feels like a story I read about someone else, a strange, dark fairy tale. But the lesson of it is etched into my soul. Pride is a fragile vintage. Arrogance has an aftertaste of ashes. And sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't a loud explosion, but the quiet, subtle, and irreversible transformation of something priceless into something worthless. It's the quiet knowledge that you have turned a king's finest wine into vinegar, and then made him drink it and call it divine. And so my story comes to a close. It's a reminder that the grandest stages are often the most fragile, and the most powerful weapons are not always the loudest. Sometimes the deepest cut comes from a truth quietly revealed. Now I turn it over to you. Have you ever had an experience where someone's greatest pride was also their greatest weakness? A time when a symbol of their power became the very tool of their downfall? I believe these moments are more common than we think, hidden in the quiet corners of our own lives. Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. Your experiences are the lifeblood of this channel. A reminder that none of us are alone in our journey. If this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to her revenge arc for more tales of quiet, calculated justice. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be patient, be clever, and remember the power that lies in knowing the truth when no one else does.